Good evening from New York. I'm Ali Velshi in for Chris Hayes. If Democrats have any hope of reining in Donald Trump and holding him accountable for the corruption and abuses under his second term, they've got to take back the U.S. Senate. And while Republicans are still favored to win the chamber, the map has become substantially more favorable for Democrats in recent weeks. Take Texas, for example. MS Now still rates that as lean Republican, but that's a far cry from the safe Republican rating that you might be expecting to see in a place like Texas. And that's due in large part to the incredibly tight race that the Democrat James Tallarico is running against the Republican Ken Paxton, a flawed candidate to say the least. The latest Emerson College poll has Paxton up by 1 point with a hugely consequential 5% still undecided. Now, Democrats would need to be having an extremely good night in the midterm elections for Texas to turn blue. Texas has been particularly difficult for Democrats to crack statewide. That said, it's not outside the realm of possibility. All recent polls from Texas paint a similar picture, a much more favorable environment for the Democrat. In fact, that's led the Cook Political Report to rate Texas as a toss-up. They've changed it to a toss-up. Now, MS Now, as I said, has not made that call. But James Tallarico does seem to be on the upswing. And I should tell you, Tallarico will be joining me to talk about all of this later in the show. But even if James Tallarico wins in Texas, Democrats have a lot of work ahead of them on November 3rd. They'd still need to flip 3 more Senate seats and hold their current seats in Michigan and Georgia in order to take control of the Senate. Now, one of the pickups they seem bullish on is Ohio. MS Now rates Ohio as a toss-up. But it's increasingly looking more promising for Democrats. The candidate there, the Democratic candidate, you know him, Sherrod Brown. He's a former 3-term senator from the state who's polling 8 points ahead of the incumbent Republican in the latest Fox News poll. Now, Sherrod Brown is a household name. He's a guy who's been in public office for 50 years. He's really leaned into an issue, however, that has broad appeal across the political spectrum: opposing data centers.
He's been called the face of data centers in Ohio. Why? Because Jon Husted spent years aggressively recruiting data centers to the state, cutting sweetheart tax deals and fast-tracking approvals, while ordinary residents watch their electricity bills explode.
We are here with Ohio Senator Jon Husted. We have a lot of experience with something called data centers.
Jon Husted. Who's he really working for?
Now, that kind of messaging, which, by the way, we've seen in other races across the country, it seems to be resonating with voters. A recent Politico poll found that 41% of Americans oppose building a data center within 3 miles of where they live, with just 24% supporting the idea. It's near a flip of where those numbers were just a few months ago, by the way, and even Republicans are taking notice of the trend. Axios reports that Senate Republican Campaign Committee sent a memo to leading AI companies warning, quote, more than any other thing in this race, data centers are the anchor hanging around Senator Jon Husted's neck. This has become a sleeper issue for the entire election cycle, end quote. Now, most Republicans are waking up to what that memo calls a toxic brand around these kinds of projects. Back in May, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed legislation giving local communities the authority to reject data center development, while over in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott announced the state would halt data center approvals until an audit of their effect on the electrical grid could be completed. But the most visible Republican in the country still seems like he's not seen that memo at all.
And I can say if I were the mayor of a town or the governor of a state and I had a chance to get a big plant in, an AI plant or a data center, I would absolutely want it. Maybe it can use a little public relations help. But if I were a governor or mayor, I would want that plant in my community.
Maybe Palm Beach just found a great new location for a data center, but Trump's sentiment seems on theme for a president whose popularity is barely above that of the data centers themselves. And that unpopularity is part of what is boosting Democrats' chances across the country as they push to flip those key Senate seats and take control of the Senate. Sherrod Brown's an Ohio Democrat. He served as a United States Senator for 3 terms up until 2025. He's now running to replace Jon Husted and to get back the seat that he once held. Senator Sherrod Brown, nice to see you on the show. Good to have you here
Thank you very much for having me on. I look forward to it.
Let's talk about this for a second. There are several issues with data centers. They're big server farms, right? We always have had server rooms for computing, but AI has really supercharged this. And the main problems are that they take up a lot of land, they increase property values, they sometimes in a way that makes it unaffordable, they decrease property values in other places, they use up a lot of electricity, and the usage of that electricity doesn't all fall on the data center company, and they use a lot of water because they've got to be cooled. There's a whole lot of reasons why Donald Trump seems to be on the wrong side of this issue.
Well, and I would say no one, I'm not a pundit, but no one has done more for data centers than John Husted. He pushed the legislature in Columbus, $2.5 billion in tax breaks, no local input on these coming to your community, 226 of them, I believe, at last count, in Ohio built or in the process of being built. And nobody really trusts the data centers or John Husted to make sure that the electricity rates aren't raised for local people. Ohio has some of the largest electricity rate increases in the country for two reasons. John Husted is involved in a bribery scandal with First Energy, a $61 million bribe, and the data center. So he has sort of the worst of both worlds because he was, as you know, Ali, he was a special interest guy in Columbus when he got appointed to the Senate. Now he's a special interest guy in Washington. That's why he'll have so much help from the outside, from special interest groups.
So there are very few issues that unite Republicans and Democrats. I mean, this is one of those weird ones where people just don't want these things, certainly don't want them close to them. I suppose if you could figure out a way to get data centers in a place that doesn't affect your water and your pollution and your noise, they do require a lot of energy. So now some of them are building electricity generation plants right near them, which is causing pollution and endless noise. What's the solution to the idea that we're using more AI everywhere, whether you're using it on your phone personally or you're interacting with companies that use it? What is a reasonable government solution to this in which the government can be a regulator while not being a Luddite?
Well, don't hear the word Luddite all that often on these shows. Thank you. I know what isn't the solution. What isn't the solution is big tax breaks coming out of the legislature, thanks to John Husted, higher electric rates, no local input. I mean, these all of a sudden, I don't think 3 years ago, most of us knew what a data center was.
Correct.
And all of a sudden they're coming into your communities and you're paying more. And we know the kind of people that fund this. I mean, I know my whole career has been spent taking on whether it's Wall Street or the drug companies or the oil companies. And so I'll have a gazillion dollars spent against me. That's why I ask viewers to come to sherrodbrown.com and kick in 10 or 15 or 20 bucks. That's a big part of how I raise my campaign money against these special interests. So we've got to figure out how to do this without that abuse of the public trust that John Husted is probably number one in the country on.
Yeah, the point that you just made is very important, though, because this is the equivalent of big pharma or big oil. There is a lot of money going into primaries and now into the general election in November in favor of candidates who will not regulate AI companies and not regulate these data centers. It's a lot of money. We're talking about billions of dollars, not millions.
Yeah, I mean, there's pick your poison. In my last race, more money was spent against me by dark money than any Senate race in history. We know it was tens of millions of dollars from Wall Street, $10 millions from the oil industry, tens of millions of dollars from drug companies. They do that because they would rather the other guy wins. I mean, they all want Husted to win because, as I said, he was a special interest guy in state government in Columbus, especially for the electric utilities and the insurance companies. Now he's a special interest guy in Washington, especially for data centers and for Wall Street. And for, that's who he is. And voters know that. And even though there'll be way more spent against me, and that's why I asked at sherrodbrown.com, I won't say that again, but, they know that, and we know that, and there are a lot. I had an event in Toledo tonight. I'm in Toledo right now. I had an event in Toledo. 250 people showed up on a Thursday night at a rally. 250 people, and it's 73 or 4 or 5 days before the election. So people are coming out. The other day I was in Eastern Ohio in Appalachia, small Republican county. Expected a dozen veterans to show up, and 50 veterans showed up to talk about the war and the long-term costs of the war to our soldiers and our communities and our VA. They talked about the cuts in the big, beautiful bill. I mean, we're seeing people engaged, including middle of the roaders and Republicans who haven't been engaged before. And that's why I'm optimistic this year, and why these people that have just sold out to special interest are going to go packing.